about the annual emissions. And what we are talking of that, okay, you work and you progress. And the path that is to be taken. So this is, the yellow one is the annual emissions of US over the years. And this is the path taken by India and China over the years. So now if someone talks of mitigation and all those issues, it would be hard to make the people in these two countries go for that. This is what China is doing. Right? This is where India is. Mind you, this is annual emissions, not per capita. And in terms of economy, I think
can they download Gapminder and look
yes,
at this?
yes.
You have to go on the website.
Yeah, you could go to the website, you could also download this.
Does the size of the dots indicate population?
Yeah.
Or-
Yes. This is the per capita income which we are talking about.
How seriously do people in India talk about population control and reproductive rights?
People are quite serious, but again the whole issue of population size and income level comes into play.
Yeah.
India being such a diverse country, the opportunity cost of having children is much higher for the higher income group. But for the lower income group, the opportunity cost is lower, whereas the children serving as source of income is much greater. That's the whole issue of population and bidirectional relationship between development and population.
To what extent, at this point, to what extent do you feel cultural / religious issues play a part?
In population control in India,
Yeah.
very marginal. It comes down to economic issues.
How would that compare with rest of South Asia, specifically, let's say, Pakistan, Bangladesh?
I am not that much aware about the cultural situation there, but the problem with comparison between India and Pakistan and Bangladesh both is that Pakistan and Bangladesh both are sort of religiously more homogeneous societies. So you don't have the comparison scale of them with the Indian context.
I mean, people oftentimes frame it not as an opportunity cost, but as like, I guess you would think human rights via women's autonomy. Is that something that gets discussed?
In India,
Yeah.
regarding population control,
Yeah.
no, that is not that much discussed.
It doesn't-
Those are discussed in small pockets,
Mhm.
small groups. Maybe they are highlighted in the media, but that is not the case at the ground level.
Yeah, because that's not the major driver in a sense in India, right? I mean, so I don't know. I mean, I don't hear so much issues about abortion versus pro this, pro life,
Not
pro
that.
that. That is almost happens.
Rajesh, you wanted to ask?
Yeah, so you said Bangladesh and Pakistan are more religious, homogeneous, but India is also 81% Hindu. So is it not more again homogeneous? It's not say 40-60 or 30-70 or even 50-50, 81 or 82%.
One quick side question: are you doing a selfie while you're asking that?
No.
No, you see, 19% is a very big population in India. And that 19%, when you talk of, there are different types of socio-religious cultural groups, then it makes it really diverse. And then also the 81% Hindus in India are not homogeneous groups, because Hindus in India are also quite a diverse lot, with the South Indians and the North Indians having different sets of socio-religious rituals, cultures, different from being that part of Eastern India. So even within that 81% Hindus, it is more or less, I would say, at least three completely different sects are there.
So when there was partition, right, and at that point in time, Pakistan had about the same number of Hindus, percentage of Hindus as India had Muslims, right? At that time, roughly speaking, which was what, about 12, 15%. And now India has about what? 19%. What is the fraction in Pakistan of Hindus?
Less than 7.
Less than?
Less than 7.
7? 7 is high.
Less
But
than
still
7.
less than 7%.
If you think of the
So is that, so,
Pakhtuns as Hindus.
yeah, but okay, so that's one aspect of, making, becoming homogeneous, I would guess. But then there are other factions there, right? So Shia, Sunnis, this, that, there are all kinds of things that you hear about. So is that really homogeneous at all?
No, Pakistan has that sort of, as I told that this is, there may be differences within them, but in a certain sense of the whole culture of looking at religion, looking at the population control policy, they are more of uniformity rather than hearing.
So is it harder, would it be harder over there to talk about population control?
Of course. But it would be easier also. In the sense that if there is a shift, that shift would apply to the whole of the country.
Why should there be a shift?
No, that is the question. Why should there be a shift?
There is a shift. Okay. So to John's point, then population is not so much a human rights issue then here,
No,
or
it is
pro-life,
basically an
or-
economic issue.
It's an economic issue, but there are religious factors which are different. In
I'd
how
like to
much?
ask some women if they think it's a human rights issue.
Huh? Huh?
I'd like to ask some women if they think it's a human rights issue. Like if they feel like
No, no, no.
childbirth is compulsory.
No, that's not, I don't think that's what he's saying. So is that perceived to be, or is that how it's portrayed as to be the, if you think of population control, what is the most important thing that is highlighted, that is perceived as, right? And these are the things that is perceived as, right? So in the US, if you think of population, those are the issues that will be highlighted.
Mhm.
Here, there are some other issues.
Yeah.
There
Or
are
like the gender gap and female
huge
feticide.
gender gap. Huh? Oh.
Like female feticide?
Female feticide is an issue in India,
Yeah.
but it is again in certain pockets,
Yeah.
like in states of Haryana and Punjab, and then also in some parts of say Jharkhand and Bihar, but not in Rajasthan also. But again, if you delve deeper, it comes down to an economic situation because of the social customs of dowry and land being only the male children having access to cultivation and all those issues.
Okay, so going back to Jonas' point again, right? So other than the very top sort of creamy layer, if you will, and creamy in terms of economy or in terms of education, whatever you want to put it, where you may have these issues about, some of the same issues that you hear in developed countries, maybe, right? About population being human rights, except there even that would probably not be relevant, because that creamy layer in a sense would probably be more progressive than if you look at the entire population of the developed countries, right? But other than that, do females even have a voice? Do women even have a voice in these things? If you just go out of that band.
I would refer back to the National Family Health Survey, which comes up with something like around 35% of rural women in India have a voice in family size and family planning.
35%.
Yeah, but that is not too small given the perspective of rural India.
I guess what I'm thinking about is you say it comes down to an economic issue about dowries and male children only having access to land, so that seems like a gender issue to me,
Yeah.
right? So I don't necessarily think,
It's very hard to, even understand rural India unless, we have spent a lot of time on that.
Yeah.
It's very different from what you have seen. Dharavi is not rural India.
Yeah, no, I'm just trying to ask questions to figure out.
No, yes, absolutely.
It's absolutely fine with me.
Yeah.
Anything more? Continue with this. Okay, what has been the main contours of climate change policy in India has been is the first point that it talks of is protect the poor and vulnerable sections of the society and achieve national growth objectives. So climate policy is only a byproduct of what India's growth policy would be. It talks of efficient and cost-effective strategies for end-use demand-side management. Deploy technology for adaptation and mitigation, devise market, regulatory and voluntary tools, and the thrust is on per capita emissions and the clean development ethics. Now, this effective implementation of adaptation and mitigation programs are sought to be achieved through linkages with civil society, local government institutions, and public-private partnership, basically with the corporates and industry. It would also look at international cooperation for research and development, sharing and transfer of technologies enabled by additional funding, and global IPR regime that facilitates technology transfer to developing countries. So these are the basic contours of India's climate policy. To do that, it has announced 8 national missions. National Solar Mission, you have gone through some of these. Solar Mission, Mission for Enhanced Energy Efficiency, Sustainable Habitat, Water Mission, Sustaining the Himalayan Ecosystem, National Mission for Green India, National Mission for Sustainable Agriculture, and National Mission on Strategic Knowledge for Climate Change. And we have already looked at the National Water Mission sort of document, and I would say that these are all lofty goals and objectives without any concrete institutional framework in place to address those issues. For example, let us start with National Solar Mission. It talks of promoting solar energy for power generation and other end-use substitution. It speaks that it will be a competitive substitute to fossil fuel options, which requires prices of solar energy to come down. It talks of graduating from kilowatt range of distributed solar, thermal and solar photovoltaic to gigawatt scale of priced and dispatchable power in next 25 years. So for the next 25 years, India is talking of moving from a local solar photovoltaic cell enabled situation to a situation where gigawatt level power can be transmitted over grid from solar thermal stations, solar power stations. Now, cogeneration, compulsory mix and subsidies. These are the instruments that you have been seeing over the last few years. That is, you have to produce a certain amount of pure electricity from different sources. There has to be a compulsory mix of your purchase profile of the distribution agencies, and there are subsidies provided to renewable energy companies. Two big problems here. One, the renewable energy certificate scam, which I have already talked about. The second is one which affects the India-US relationship, the domestic component criteria. India has put in place a clause that all renewable energy equipment purchasers has to have 8% of that as domestically produced component. This is being challenged by US, and it is, I think it will go to the WTO and a whole lot of issues there, because according to US this is a sort of unfair trade practice. The issue over here in the Indian policy context is that, do we want renewable energy to spread, or do we want renewable energy equipment producers in India to flourish, or do we want to be dependent on imports from outside? So these issues are to be addressed here. Energy efficiency in industry, it talks of sector-specific technological options. It also talks of cross-cutting technological options that would affect all the industries. Fuel switch options like moving from diesel generator sets to photovoltaic sets, and then to sort of the movement from the transport sector moving from diesel to CNG, and for Calcutta from moving from diesel to LPG. It talks of technology transfer and multilateral funding of all such processes and procedures. What are the options available, or what are the processes that have been put into place? There are tax break and depreciation allowances, that is fiscal incentives for the industry. India is strongly promoting energy service companies. These are the companies which will make energy audit and provide the industry a blueprint for moving from a high energy intensive production process to a low energy intensive production process. It also views the clean development mechanism as a cheap source of financing these projects. However, there is a low sectoral coverage, very few sectors are covered under this, and for the electricity sector as of, the grid loss is not targeted. We are not talking at all about 35 to 40% of the power produced is lost in the grid transportation. So we are not at all addressing the grid loss issue.
So grid loss, just to ask you, grid loss in the developed nations, in the US, for example, would roughly be what of the, I mean, it varies widely, but roughly be of the order of sometimes 5 to 10%.
Yeah.
So that's the issue here. I mean, there is loss.
There is loss, but it has to come down. And the problem with grid loss in India is it is not only a technical issue, it is also an issue of commercial losses, like pilferage, like obvious cases where power has been used but not billed for. So then you do not have a check on how much has been the total consumption. We are talking of sustainable habitat in terms of energy conservation building code. There is a building code in place. There is the issue of municipal solid waste disposal and composting, and promotion of mass urban public transport. That is fuel switch from buses to monorails and metro rails. What has been done so far? CFL has been subsidized. User charges by urban local bodies for financing municipal solid waste disposal. The proposal was put forward. It has not been accepted throughout the country. Private-public partnership and funding for MRTS in cities, which is in place. And the whole issue of rail and road mix. Ideally, long-haul traffic should be by rail and short-haul traffic by road. In India, what has happened is that because of railways being such a politically volatile ministry, freight charges have been increased, whereas passenger charges have been kept low. Because of this, long-haul cargo movement in India is mostly by road rather than by rail. So this is an issue on the emission. Yeah.
In the United States, the role of corporate America in our democracy is a kind of a huge issue. And I was just wondering in India, how strong the role of corporate India was, because I know during our war game it felt like industry had a lot of power, but as far as in actual like passing bills in India and passing laws in India, like how strong is the voice of corporate India?
Corporates are very strong in India in lobbying and having their say in specific sectors, bills that relate to specific sectors. But what has happened over the years is that while on one hand we are providing certain advantages to the corporates in terms of legislation, at the same time there is an effort to mitigate that by providing certain SOPs to the common people. So at the end, in some cases, it is like a vicious cycle. It goes down and down. When you provide SOPs to someone, then you provide SOPs to certain other groups. So it becomes a sort of a competition of populism. In certain other cases, well, there have been issues where there are good legislation that have been put in place because of corporate pressure, because you need to have certain sort of industrial policy, long-run policy in place. So it has both its advantages and disadvantages. But yes, corporates do play a big role in lobbying and passing legislation.
Just to sort of add a little bit there, because just based on my experiences in what I've seen in the US and here, and what do I know, but I think it's a very good question. Interestingly enough, I think despite the US being in a sense a more mature democracy, there is a lot of power among a very few people, right? And it's increasing. So if you look at the current Supreme Court, it's increasing. I'm not saying it's good or bad or anything, no judgment at this point at least, but it's increasing. I don't think it's that much in India. What is done for the poor, that counts, especially in terms of votes. So what you would see in
And
these
because
planning,
of the role of media also.
because of the role of media. Yes, media is very free and media would highlight those things. What you would see in these kind of war game things, there is also a very good question, in these kind of national plans, let's say. Their industry would have a strong voice. The government, especially let's say this new government, would listen to the industry. But then what they do is these plans would come more or less like this war game, or at least towards the end what this war game was becoming. It was becoming like a real thing. But then, as he's saying, at some point, okay, here is this thing coming from here, and then here are some other things we need to do to also get the votes from. In India, remember,
Sugar coating.
yeah. But in India, one interesting difference is that the poor do vote a lot. The poor, underprivileged in most
their
other
voting
democracies,
percentage is more than that of the rich.
which is very different from
The
I think
rural voting
almost
percentage
anywhere
is
else.
rural voting percentage is almost always 10 to 15 percentage points higher than the urban voting percentage.
Which is very different from
And then
the
again,
Yeah.
in the urban side also, if you look at the spatial distribution, it is more in the poorer sections of the town compared to the upper middle class sections.
There's just so many fundamental differences here. That's one of the things. It's very hard to, and that's Dr. Sheshangira was saying that also in the context of GMOs, just a little bit of digression, right? It's very difficult to come with a single point agenda. This is bad, this is good, and let me enforce this here, or let me try what I can do. There's just so many differences. You need to first understand each and everything, both what goes on within these sectors, across the sectors, then say, okay, these are things that needs to be done here are the priorities. But this is one example of it. India is probably the only, as far as I know, there may be other examples, but the only democratic nation which has been a democracy for a while, where the poor and underprivileged vote much more than the rich percentage-wise.
Do you have any ideas as to why that is the case?
Why?
Why is that the case in India as opposed
Do you have any ideas?
You see, the universal franchising had started quite a long time back. And at that time, what happened is that there was this only one political power regime, party that was dominating. So participation was sort of like a participation in a, I would say, some sort of festival at that point of time. So participation was ensured from that point of time. That going out on the voting day and casting the vote is not only my right, not only it is dependent on the ideology, but it is also has become a custom, a ritual, and also a place where, you see that whether I have voted or not keeps my place in my peer group and society. So that has been ingrained. When children have seen their parents taking it very seriously and going to vote, then that also builds up.
But one could argue that the US has a culture of democracy for a long time. You could also argue that in a sense the US options are limited because there are only these two parties now, and many of their policies are the same. But still, this has been going on.
Maybe
for
the
a while.
other thing is that I don't know about the US in terms of local bodies. In India, we have elections for the local bodies also. That at the ward level, that would be around 200 households. And those councillors or GP members are in charge of the day-to-day things, like sewerage, like paving the roads, like power connection, like water connection. So then those sort of facilities are taken for granted in West. But here, whether I have a working, effective person at the ground level as my representative makes a difference between whether I have the roads in my ward, in my locality are paved, whether sewerage connection is good or not. So then the poor or even the common people, they think that I have this power to get access to these facilities by choosing correctly and by voting out the people who are not doing so good. And that builds up even at the state and national level. We have these 3 tier of elected bodies and they operate at different levels. So that is again maybe one thing that.
Is it hard to register to vote?
Yeah.
Is it difficult to register to vote?
No, not at all.
I feel like it is in the US.
In the US it is, we're sort of working anti-suffrage
Oh, is it?
in the United States. Yeah, we're actively trying to take people off the
Yeah,
voting
so
rolls.
for you,
If
someone
you
like
live in
you, it is.
Florida, for example, like, so people who are felons in Florida, formerly felons can't vote anymore. We're making like the system of identification much more
Yeah, the whole,
obscure.
like elderly people with.
In
no
India it is the other
identification.
extreme. Even convicts can run for elections.
And they do win,
Then they-
more than 30%.
Supreme Court decision about,
yeah, if you are convicted in a say criminal procedure, you cannot stand for elections for the next 12 years.
That's it.
So just coming back to the slide, it talks of lots of incentives which are provided by the government, but I think on the same level, there are mandatory rules which are coming into play as well. You know, houses which are about 2,000 square feet need to
Yeah,
substitute power with.
that is the building code. That's the building code.
No, isn't that strong as well in terms of incentivizing and also at the same time bringing in more regulations into the
Yes,
place?
of course. But again, as I said, that these have very low coverage. Because the implementation of the building code is again sort of the type of houses that are being built. It's very small percentage would actually fall under those stipulations.
True, but all commercial ventures
Yes.
are.
The National Water Mission, which we have been talking of, it talks of estimating river flows in mountainous areas, customizing models for regional water basins, water harvesting and recharge, in those broad terms, as we saw the other day. It talks of regulation of power tariffs for irrigation, enhanced storage and flow capacity. It also talks of conservation of wetlands. How it is going to be done is not spelled out. But what is not being addressed is demand assessment and management. And in India, it is more a problem of demand assessment and management of water resources rather than the whole issue of supply side. The Himalayan ecosystem, it talks of land use planning and watershed practices, infrastructure construction, traditional agro-horticulture to be the main focus. It also talks of promoting sustainable tourism, like this whole place is plastic-free zone. However, it does not talk of impact of forest degradation and dams on the ecosystem. This is one thing which is missing. Last year we had a catastrophe in the Uttaranchal, whole sudden rains and 3 or 4 holy places and the roads and everything was washed away. After that, the Supreme Court had put a bar on about more than 250 water projects and electricity projects are coming up there, of which 50 would require building of dams. So they were stopped by the Supreme Court pending a report. The report was submitted to the government. The committee was constituted by the government. A report was submitted which talks of the negative impact of those dams. But after that, what the government did is that it did not accept the proposals and suggestions put forward by the report, and it pleaded at the Supreme Court to do away with the stay order so that construction of the dams can be carried out. So this is the big issue which is coming up. Again, the indigenous management of the Himalayan ecosystem, the traditional knowledge sharing among different groups, indigenous groups who stay in that place, those places. And then the whole Himalayan ecosystem is not a single homogeneous ecosystem. The situation in the northeastern parts of the Himalayas is completely different from the Uttaranchal, from where our friend Manoj comes from, which is again very different from the cold desert of Ladakh. So these issues of microclimates are not at all considered, not at all addressed in the whole Himalayan ecosystem southland. Again, Mission for a Green India talks of forests as repositories of genetic diversity and forests as carbon sinks. The livelihood of forest-based communities are not addressed. There are talks of enhancing investments for raising plantations. We have a system of joint forest management where the forest department prepares a joint forest management committee along with the local residents of the villagers who are dependent on the forest. And the joint forest management committee is empowered for taking decisions regarding felling of trees, collection of non-timber products from the forest, selling them and dividing the whole value, sale value among the villagers and the forest department. Now how to upscale that to a national level has not been addressed in the National Green Mission. Then there are issues of land ownership of the tribals. As the Forest Rights Act was passed, there are issues of tribals being evicted from their forest land in the name of expanding plantations, in the name of preventing unauthorized, I would say, production of NTFPs, and then there is issue of land conversion. You know that recently, yeah,
Oh, well, you said yesterday that Kerala is like pro-forestation, basically. Like there's not deforestation here, they want forestation.
I think that was Glenn Roy was talking of afforestation.
Oh, okay, someone mentioned forestation, but I'm mentioning also investing in like plantations, and I'm guessing like rubber plantations. But it's my understanding that's not quite exactly the ideal forestation. Like creating more rubber plantations isn't as good as planting other types of trees that aren't going to be used for economic benefit.
Yes, I mean, Kerala is a sort of different issue altogether because in
Or in general as well.
In South Kerala at least, you don't have that many number of industries. And the land topology, natural resources is such that it does not also favor large-scale industrialization. So what can the government do to enhance livelihood? Either it can go for plantations of cash crops, which can earn money, and it can also go for natural or nature-based tourism. So these are the two main activities that are promoted by the government in South Kerala, which is different from the resource-rich, mineral-rich forests of central India. As I was just going to tell you that in Orissa, you have this huge natural resource of mines, minerals. And there have been a really sort of internal war going on there between the tribes and the government who has actually given permission for a large steel plant and a mine to come up. And the tribals there who are going to be displaced because of the mine and the plant, steel plant, are not allowing that to come up. So it has been raging on for quite some time now. There have been deaths, there have been armed conflicts there between the government and the tribals there. Now what has happened is that the whole issue of displacement and land rehabilitation has been taken up by the National Land Use Rehabilitation Act, which has made it mandatory for companies to obtain 80% of the land from the tribals directly. Only after that, for the 20% of remaining land, the government will step in, acquire land on their behalf and handing them over. Now the industry says that it will increase land prices too much. It will lead to micro deals with each landowner, fragmented landowner. Whereas the human rights and the groups who want to protect the tribals' rights, they say that it is usually an unequal bargaining power between the industry and the tribals. And often there have been land mafia who have been grabbing land on behalf of the industrialists and then selling them back to the industrialists at a high price. So all these issues have to be taken into consideration before we come up with a sort of plan for either forests being used as the tribals' livelihood option or as a resource for industrialization or as carbon sinks. So this has not been adequately addressed in the national policy. Again, crop insurance mechanism, one of the major problems with India is the crop insurance mechanism. It is very paltry sum which is being given to them as crop insurance if the crop is destroyed because of natural factors. And crop insurance mechanism is not very strong also. It is sporadic. There are instances where you are entitled to get 100 rupees, but either you have to wait 2 years to get those 100 rupees or you can settle down for 50 rupees now. So those issues have to be addressed. Fuel and fertilizer policy. Two things which talk of sustainable agriculture are missing there. There are talks of development of which came up, the GMO crops, drought and pest resistant crop varieties through genetic engineering. That has been one of the highlighted objective of the government, but that has not been addressed adequately in terms of its impact assessment. There are talks of improved methods to conserve soil and water and financial support to enable farmers to invest in adopt relevant technologies. Now both these are actually in terms of objectives and no concrete institutional framework or quantitative targets are put in place to achieve these.
So in terms of GMO, I just try to go back to that discussion because it's important and it's also a major deal in.
The national mission talks of strategic knowledge, all sort of blah blah blah, but there is no concrete proposal, and a strategic knowledge mission having no link with the other missions like solar mission, water mission and other things are not there. There is no skill gap assessment, like what is the scientific manpower that would be required to meet this strategic knowledge mission is not there. We do not know what type of people we need to have in the next 10 years and what is the training mechanism in place to bring out those scientists. And again, we go to a premier institution of science and we are shocked to hear that people there are not talking of local solutions. Problems is not focused, broad-based proclamations with development as agenda and climate policy as byproduct. And there is domestic versus international agenda and no defined and quantitative target. As against this, what is the climate action plan of USA? The last President's declaration. It talks of GHG emission 17% below 2005 levels by 2020. The climate change adaptation plans at the national level and local level. It wants to lead international efforts to combat global climate change by enhancing multilateral and bilateral engagement. It also talks of promoting clean development mechanism in developing countries through trade and aid, and not, as was in the earlier declaration, through aid and trade. You have to underline this.
So this is so, well, I'm at a loss for the right word, I don't want to use the word that I'm thinking of. I mean, if you cannot even, as a nation, US is obviously the leader and has to be the leader in